If you look at Chris's bio, it is ridiculous. Like when I found out that there was going to be a national cyber director, I mean, that's a pretty big title, and you go, what are you doing? And what is it actually going to accomplish? And it's Senate appointed, directly reporting to the president. You go, oh man, that's, who in the world are they going to find for that? And then you see Chris and go, yeah, my problem is not who are they going to find for it, it's who are they going to find after Chris. When you look at his bio, 41 years of federal service, 28 over at the National Security Agency, retired as a brigadier general in the Air Force and a pilot. One of the things that he mentioned to me one time that I got a huge kick out of is he's an Air Force Academy grad and Air Force officer, and he was teaching at the Naval Academy. Like, what the heck are you doing? You know, these dirty Navy people, what are you doing? And it's like, yeah, it takes a good Air Force officer to teach a Navy officer how to be one. So it's he's a fantastic individual, really, really genuinely moving the needle for this country. I had the privilege of serving under him when he was the deputy director at the NSA. We didn't have a lot of time to interact. I was a little more lowly, but I will always remember that he came to our field site one time in Germany. And this to me summarizes Chris much more than all of the accolades, all the awards, all the experience. He came to Germany one time. We had a young, like E2, young enlisted guy raise his hand during a town hall with the deputy director of the NSA. And it wasn't about mission and ops and counterterrorism work and whatever else. It was him complaining about the coffee maker and wanting to make sure the deputy director of the NSA knew that we did not have good coffee at that field site. And Chris spent, I'm probably exaggerating here, but it felt like 20 minutes just making this person feel that they were the most important person in the world. This was the most important question that he ever received, made sure that it was important, made sure that it got resolved. That's Chris. It's not just the high level accolades and everything else. You genuinely feel like the most important person in the world when you're around Chris. So Chris, thanks for joining us today. He's going to give us his thoughts and what's going on around the country. And then Tim and I are going to come back and ask him moderated questions after the fact. So Chris, if you can, please, sir, take it away.
Rob, thanks very much for that warm, generous introduction. I guess my career has been long enough. I must have been happy at some point, but this job is, I think, it's a great job, and it's a great opportunity to serve alongside people like you and Tim and everybody on this session to try to figure out how do we actually make a difference. It's one thing to talk at length about cyber, but how do we make a determinative difference? And so I'll talk a little bit about what I think we might do about that. I'm going to offer some context up front to perhaps set the stage. At the end of the day, since this conference is focused on ICS, something that I don't think we talk about enough, I will address some of the specific and unique aspects of that. But I think the common context is really important. We need to set that stage first. So let me just begin at the beginning. I think any philosophy of cybersecurity has to address all the facets of the given ecosystem. And for my money and my experience, I can think of at least 3 ways to cut that. Of course, there's technology. That's a particular area where OT and IT differ somewhat. And it's what most people think about when they think about cyber. Close your eyes and you think about a world swimming with stuff in it. But people are in cyberspace as well. People don't simply get served by cyberspace. The choices they make determine cyber outcomes all day, every day. And doctrine is in cyberspace. That's a fancy military term, but roles and responsibilities, meaning do we know who is responsible for what? And I mention those 3 things because if we're talking about an adversary's perspective, they always think about those 3 things, and they typically think about those in reverse order. First thing they're going to try to figure out is this thing I want to hold at risk properly defined in terms of, do they know who is accountable for what? If they've got bad doctrine, I'm going to take that to the bank. If the doctrine's shored up, we know who's responsible for what, then I'm going to see if I can't find somebody who's not up to speed on a given day, somebody who's on the front line of the system I'm going to hold at risk. And I'll hold that perhaps at risk. I'll hold the people skills at risk. And if I need to, I will go find some technology vulnerability and I'll hold that at risk. But frankly, the door is too wide open on doctrine and people issues for us to actually spend all of our time or a disproportionate amount of our time on the technology alone. We've got to solve all 3 of those. where does the National Cyber Director fit in? And we're relatively new. When last year Ann Neuberger spoke to you coming from the White House, and we very much appreciate a second opportunity to come to you from the White House, we didn't exist. I showed up in July. The resources associated with this office in terms of the dollars necessary to hire, they didn't show up until November, so we're fairly new. And I'd be the first to admit that we're not filling a vacuum. There are a lot of players in this space, many, of course, in the private sector, but there's a significant number just within the federal government. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That crowded space could, in fact, be a decided advantage for us. That's where depth of expertise comes from. Stovepipes are not inherently evil. If you want to have deep and sharp experience, you better have a stovepipe or 2 or 10. But what we need to increasingly do is to figure out how do we use those all in a collaborative fashion so that we get something greater than the arithmetic sum. For too long, we've actually used all of those disparate, diverse assets as individual strengths, siloed strengths, using what I would describe as a division of effort. As opposed to, and that's really an agreement to not collaborate, as opposed to saying, how do we combine those talents, those insights, those authorities in a way that an adversary, make this very plain, in a way that an adversary has to beat all of us to beat one of us. That would be different. That would be a new day. Frankly, that's what we've been doing some of over the last 3-4 months, but I'll save that perhaps for later in these kind of hopefully brief remarks. So my job, first and foremost, as the National Cyber Director, is to not achieve hierarchical domination of all those pieces and parts. We don't need that. This is a horizontal system, but it needs to be one that's strapped together so that it operates coherently, collaboratively, that each of those pieces complement one another. So my first job is to achieve some degree of coherence within the federal enterprise. Then to make sure that we have some degree of coherence and collaboration between the federal government and the external world, both the private sector and then state, local, tribal, territorial. In that regard, I'm supposed to be the coach, not necessarily the on-the-field micromanager or quarterback. I want to elevate the discussion so that we have the thought leadership necessary to know what we, each of us, can do, that we know how to each of us participate in the defense of this realm, and ultimately make sure that this increasingly becomes a capital expenditure exercise, not merely an operational exercise. It's a lot of fun to respond to 2 and 3 alarm fires, but it's not very useful in the end when all you've done is to perhaps reduce the amount of char and burn in the enterprise. We need to get to a place where we prevent some of these activities by building resilience into our doctrine, to our people skills, to our technology, and to do that in a way that what then results as a defensible enterprise, we defend collaboratively. So I'm going to do some program and budget evaluation, but I'm going to take the largest possible filter on that, which is to talk about, do we have the right doctrine? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right people skills? And do we have the right dollars in the right places? My office is relatively small for a cyber concern. We're about 40 people now. It's huge, right, for the National Security Council, which I sit alongside of. And so we complement what Ann Neuberger and the National Security Council does. In her role, she's trying to make sure she uses all instruments of power outside of cyberspace, diplomacy, intelligence assets, military assets, legal assets, all those things that traditionally the role of the National Security Council, she will continue to bring those to bear. My job is to make sure that we're using all the assets inside cyberspace, which are many, to ensure that we're achieving a proper defensible enterprise and we're actually defending it. Lines of effort that I've undertaken then are budget and resource assessment, strategy and research, making sure that we have increasingly a strategy that works not just for the federal government, but for the nation. Cybersecurity planning and operations. Do we have roles and responsibilities properly defined up front? Making sure we've got the right policies and programs, making sure that we double down on supply chain and technology security by design, making sure that we take care of the most important component of cyberspace, people, by looking at workforce training and education. How do we solve not just those jobs that have the words cyber and IT in them, but address the skills that everybody has to have in order to get cyber right? Ordinary users, which are the most important users, kind of small businesses, concerns who perhaps do cyber work, all of those need to be addressed. And then, of course, we need to make sure that this starts at home. We need to get federal cybersecurity right. Having said all of that, I think we need to make sure that at the end of the day, we address the doctrine, the people, and the technology, probably in that order, to make a more defensible system, which we can then defend. Let me say a little bit then about operational technology, or ICS, which I know this conference is focused on. I would say, in kind of in the same breath, that it's more alike than not IT, but it does have some of its distinct differences. In that regard, I would say that all of what I just ran through is irrespective. It actually does not matter whether you're talking about IT or OT. We've got to get those three dimensions of cyberspace right. We have to make sure that if we're going to create defensible architectures, that we think about those three dimensions, regardless of whether it's IT or OT. But part of securing OT is understanding how it's like IT, secure by design, defensible, well defended, and how it's not like IT. I would say that Executive Order 14028, many of whom you're familiar with from last May, described largely features that might be attendant to an information technology architecture. Some of those were extensible to operational technology. Our zero trust architecture strategy, which will define our future, again, largely relates to an information technology system because of the terms used inside of it. But those same security features, those same attributes are things that we can think about for purposes of OT, but they're not all as applicable to OT. Why is that? Because of the uptime, the patching, the age of these systems, sometimes the unreachability of these systems makes it hard for us to actually, in the same way that we might treat IT, general purpose information technology, address the needs of resilience by design, kind of the doctrinal components and the people aspects of OT. We can't just myopically push mandates, therefore, without some distinction of what those differences are. We need to increasingly, especially for OT, think about what the compensating controls might be, in addition to the features that we would prefer be built in by design. We need to appreciate the nuance that is associated with these systems, particularly OT systems. And frankly, many of the members in this audience would understand that nuance far better than some traditional cybersecurity experts who've been raised in a world where IT is the whole domain, it's the whole world. We've not been idle in trying to think through what those differences might be. The Biden administration committed to addressing operational technology, cybersecurity in its July 2021 National Security Memorandum 5, improving the cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and control systems. We have followed through by addressing some of the specific needs of the electric sector, of the pipeline sector, of the water sectors. Now, those are siloed. We need to ultimately cut across those to make sure that we're thinking about the critical function responsibilities. But we're going to do this by addressing the kind of components that live inside those sectors. We've asked CISA, right, over at the Department of Homeland Security, to develop baseline cybersecurity performance goals for those systems. And we're assisting the National Security Council in the implementation of that National Security Memorandum 5. All of that is a solid foundation for work that takes OT on its merits as having some distinct nuanced differences from IT. Some of them might be more stark than others, but it begins to address, right, OT on its own foundations. Having said that, my summary remarks would be the following. We can't let technology's frailties, and there are many, and the threats to those run our lives. What I mean by that is that when we wake up in the morning, we shouldn't obsess about threat. We should obsess about our positive aspirations. We should get on with our lives and figure out what it was we wanted these systems to do for us in the first place. When you begin to think about that, you think about bending technology to society's interest, as opposed to kind of caving in to what the technology's frailties or its deficiencies might be. If you think about that and you actually say, hey, I want to get on with using the technology to achieve my positive aspirations, you're then more likely to make the capital expenditure investments to make it resilient by design. You're more likely to invest in the roles and responsibilities definitions because you'll understand what it is that every party is going to get out of this and therefore be willing to put your shoulder to that wheel. You're more likely then to make the investments in the people skills that are required to have everyone participate in their own defense of something they see that is a common good. You'll take positive steps to essentially make the investments necessary to ensure that the system meets your needs. I remember a quote from Jim Mattis years ago when he was asked what keeps him awake at night. He said, nothing. I keep other people awake at night. I'd actually like to think about cyberspace that way. where I don't obsess in the middle of the night about threats to that space, because during my waking hours, I've spent all the time necessary to make it resilient by design, get the doctrine right, get the people skills right, so that I can actually focus on my positive outcomes. We actually have a stunning opportunity in hand at the moment to do that. We have an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed about a month or two ago, which essentially has $1.2 trillion that's about to be invested in a manner that will essentially affect just about every physical infrastructure within the country. We're going to go to smart connected infrastructure that uses OT in ways that we've never before imagined. And having said that, if we don't actually have that positive, compelling vision about what that technology should do for us, as opposed to how we should serve it, then we're going to miss a stunning opportunity to build in resilience by design to things like electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. How do we get that such that that has cyber characteristics built into it? And we don't wake up surprised in 5 or 10 or 15 years to realize we built this massive infrastructure that doesn't have the resilience by design that we need. So all of these cybersecurity investments can be done on the back of, or perhaps through the lens of, the actual infrastructure investments we're about to make. And we are doing that. We are going to give time and attention to the capital expenditures as much or more as to the operational expenditures that respond to events in this space. Earlier this year, I've spoken to regulators at the state and local level about doing just that. I take the point that many times the margins are so small that they really aren't able to make the investments up front that we would want to have when we get to that moment where operational expenditures are required to solve or to address the deficiencies that haven't been attended to in that capital phase. We've got to do this across the life cycle so that we have defensible and defended systems, not just defended systems. My bottom line on this, and I think I take this from all of you, is I propose that you're going to have to beat all of us to beat one of us in this space. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to, in part, your answers. But my job is to essentially give voice, not just to what the federal government thinks on this space, but what to the private sector thinks about this space. Because we know that that's where most of the innovation, most of the deployment, and most of the defense takes place. Rob and Tim, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And Chris, you look, I'll just pay a compliment and then ask the question. But the compliment is I've never seen a unity of effort in an administration. We've had many good administrations, but a unity of effort of administrations to focus on industrial control systems. Like last year, as you mentioned, we had Ann Neuenberger here. I don't remember a White House level person talking about OT and ICS and the unique nature of it. And here you are again talking about that. We see that out of the ICS National Security Memorandum, like you said. And so I hope we continue to see that, because I know it means a lot to this community to not have IT guidance and IT sort of initiatives just pushed on the critical part of critical infrastructure, assuming that it's all the same. Sometimes we find that guidance can cause friction between IT and OT staffs internally. It's not that they don't want to work together, it's they're following different requirements and different mandates. So that unity of effort, that focus on ICS is definitely well received. I want to start off with almost an incredibly difficult question to start with, because you can handle it. You mentioned supply chain. And when you look at supply chain, one of the things that I think is very difficult for folks is sort of the true validation of that supply chain and what we are allowed and not allowed to buy in our industrial community. And what I mean by that is, of course, we want everybody not to go to eBay to buy a controller. We don't want anybody to go to freeprojectfiles.com to download the latest project file. Go to trusted sources, sure. But we know even beyond cyber that there are supply chain issues. I mean, our electric sector in the United States specifically is running into supply chain issues with what's happening in China and COVID and everything else, just getting transmission equipment and transformer equipment and so forth. However, you mentioned kind of the regulated entities and kind of the ways that they have to think about margins. One of the problems that's existed in the past is that the US government may have insights about don't buy that equipment or don't buy that product or don't do that thing, but they get carried off in classified discussions that the utilities and others can't use when they go to public utilities commissions and others. Or simply stated, there are asset owners in this country that know that they are making a bad choice, but their hands are tied in making that bad choice. So when you talk about supply chain, I'm interested in what the government's role, responsibility, strategy, thought process is to kind of provide some of that air cover and make sure that our asset owners and operators are allowed to make the good choices that they would like?
Well, there's about 5 hard questions in that pile. So maybe I'll try and be deft in kind of teasing out some of them. Let me start at where you ended on that, which is the government sometimes knows things that would be useful in the hands of others. I think that's a really big deal, right? The government often is in possession of what I would call actionable, granular, timely information, but I would observe it's only actionable if it's placed in the hands of actors, which in this space, more often than not, are in the private sector. I read something overnight, I can't remember the source, but we can all Google it, where somebody from the space ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, made this observation that they were, my words, shocked, stunned, and amazed that the government provided people who had not traditionally been cleared with some very explicit, actionable information that was important for them to have about threats that they would experience in their domain of interest, but for the government sharing that. That's important. That's a big deal. That's something we are increasingly doing, mindful of the sources and methods and the risk that we take that we might cut off the supply of that information. But again, it's only actionable if it's placed in the hands of the actors. So that's got to be a new kind of way of approaching this. We have to think about not just how interesting this information is, but who's going to action it and what we're going to do to make sure it's placed in the hands of those actors. With respect to the supply chain itself, just saying no to kind of technology, or for that matter, kind of geopolitical systems that we are uncomfortable with or that we find inappropriate, that's not the answer it's not the whole answer to the problem. We of course need to be in a position where we can say no and then have some alternative. So we need to make sure that our own supply chains, those systems that we're comfortable with, both in terms of the technology resilience and robustness, and the geopolitical systems that control those, offer a reasonable substitute. And that can't be done by just building discrete supply chains that have some specific end purpose. You have to address the entirety of the ecosystem. But we're now walking our way through, all of us, addressing this frailty we call Log4j, right? A ubiquitous kind of slice of software that shows up in a lot of places, a lot of OT places as well as IT places. And we're scratching our head of what do we do about that? I think in part, we need to go back to the beginning, which is how do we make sure that the people who fundamentally do the coding and the kind of the build of the piece parts, how do they actually think about their responsibilities to build resilience by design into the most kind of atomically small, the most kind of discrete kind of components of that larger system? When I was trained as a mechanical engineer many, many years ago, I started with the slide rule. That's how long ago that was. I didn't actually have a responsibility to build systems that had some environmental responsibility. That didn't kind of stop the spewing of toxic waste into whatever river I might have been operating next to. That wasn't something I was trained as having a responsibility. It was somebody else's problem. It was an applique that we'd say, we'll try to make these systems kind of consistent with whatever our societal goals are by essentially building that in later. Well, that's no longer the deal. If you're going to be trained as a mechanical engineer or any kind of an engineer today, you actually get that responsibility built in up front. We need to make sure that we do that for coders. So I would go back to the basics and say, how do we build that in terms of a fundamental responsibility of everybody that's building these systems? Then how do we preserve that along the life cycle of those systems? So software bill of materials or hardware bill of materials are useful in that regard. And then how do we create the economic incentives that people will fill that space with alternatives to those systems that we don't prefer? Now, I have mentioned twice in my remarks on this that there are both technology features that we sometimes find inappropriate and geopolitical features, and both of those actually stand into this space. And when I say that, I mean that it's not just enough to say that a system of record has built-in resilience or confidence that its technology works in a certain way, but whatever geopolitical system is going to control it, we have to make sure that the rule of law that they bring to bear is something we're comfortable with. And by definition, I would say that if it's a Russian government that can control our data, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't think any of us should be comfortable with that. There are other geopolitical systems that we've similarly made a judgment about. And so we, again, need to find like-minded nations, essentially address those things from the foundations up, populate those through the supply chain, and address this with belt, suspenders, Velcro, and zippers so that we address all of the underlying systemic features that are necessary.
Was a wonderful job of answering 5 questions in a response. I'm Mr. Inglis. It's really, really impressive as I've looked at kind of 17 years of this summit to walk through, and leaders that come in from different space at the level of kind of leadership within our government to hear the words operational technology with a deep understanding of what that means, and really kind of looking at how much we've matured, not only as an industry, as a sector, as community, but in leadership at all the highest levels, all the way up to the executive levels, is really, really impressive. So before anything else, just really appreciate you being here. I'm likely going to ask a 5-part question as well. So if you're ready for another one, where you look across this room, people that I've known and worked with for many, many years at critical infrastructure and key resource, thousands of people online joining us, that we've been through 2 years of pandemic. We are now operating critical infrastructure environments in ways that we have never allowed before, never would have accepted with remote connectivity. The risks are growing, the threats are growing, the unimaginable activities that are occurring over in Ukraine. Kind of as we're looking to all of those things as a sector, we constantly pursue and educate from near-miss studies, events analysis, lessons learned. What have we learned that we can change our operating model? And as we look to your perspective on that, what does the administration learn from what's happening in Ukraine, specifically for critical infrastructure, specifically for operational technologies? What should we be doing differently with our investments from a capital and from an operate maintain side as we're actively trying to defend against this adversary currently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just tell you what I think collectively we're learning, and we're learning this together because this is a shared enterprise. Shared threats, shared resources, shared infrastructure needs to be a shared solution. I think 2 things are bending the needle in the right direction. We're of course not where we need to be in terms of having sufficiently resilient and robust ICS, OT, or IT. We're not where we need to be, but we're getting to a better place. And we're not where we need to be in terms of the right response mechanisms, in terms of how we address frailties in those. But I think we have learned, and I'm really confident about this, I think we've learned 2 things. One, that resilience by design, right, is not optional, right? We have to do that so that we actually prevent more of these problems, because we're simply a harder target than we pat ourselves on the back because we have responded well to the frailties of the past. You know, when I was an Air Force pilot, I flew actually C-130s every week for about 22 years. That's just one large OT system. It's actually a bucket of OT systems all proceeding in the same direction at the same time. But when I did that, I learned that a good pilot can get out of any scrape. A great pilot doesn't get into them in the first place. We need to be great in cyberspace. That should be something that we take upon ourselves to say, let's get our roles and responsibilities squared away, let's get our people skills squared away, and let's get the technology squared away so that we're resilient by design. The second, I think, big lesson that we have is that a collaborative defense, which is different than a division of effort. Again, a division of effort is an agreement to not collaborate. It has its place, but it has a significant limitation in a shared space like cyberspace. A collaborative defense is the only right response. And I think that we've been doing those things, especially that latter thing, over the last 3-4 months in the presence of this Ukraine crisis. Look at what's been transpiring. The US government, not alone, but the US government in particular, has been sharing actionable, granular, timely information, not just with other governments, not just with federal agencies, but with the private sector. Back to that kind of space ISAC remark that I referenced, but also with kind of financial institutions, energy institutions, who are on the front lines of what could be the cyber blowback, so that they're prepared to know what they should do and when they should do it, with all of the resources at their disposal. We've in fact kind of participated in some collaborative endeavors in something called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative over at CISA, right? The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, but also with some sector risk management agencies, essentially putting shards of information, shreds of information, hunches on the table where we can compare and contrast these kind of partial insights and fire kind of synapses that no one of us could fire alone, discover something together that no one of us had discovered alone. And then finally, right, we've seen various actors take action in this space that heretofore have been standing off on the sidelines saying, hey, it's somebody else's problem. It's not mine to address. We've actually moved information to places where some entity might have high leverage and an ability to take some action, not just governments, Think about what Microsoft has been talking their way through. They're not alone in this, but Microsoft has talked their way through. They've seen some number of attacks in the Ukraine that would hold at risk not just their Ukrainian customers, but customers around the globe, and they've acted at speed, right, to have very, very high leverage to address those things in their tracks, stop it dead in its tracks. We've made it such that if you're a transgressor in this space, holding the Ukraine at risk, and by extension, holding the world at risk, you increasingly have to beat many of us, if not all of us, in order to beat the one of them that you're after. That's a new day. Resilience by design, collaborative defense. I think that's what the lessons are. That's what they should be.
Fantastic. I want to kind of switch gears a bit, but still keep it focused on kind of the conflict that was going on in Ukraine and what it might mean to us. Earlier this year, there was a coordinated disclosure on an industrial control system cyber capability called Pipe Dream. It was Dragos, Mandiant, Department of Energy, CISA, FBI, NSA. Everybody got together, did this coordinated disclosure. It was phenomenal to see. But what kind of stunned me a bit, and I want your perspective on, is there's a lot of folks that I've met, especially in the Beltway area, that the mindset is, yeah, obviously there's going to be espionage, obviously there's going to be intrusions, but nobody's really going to take a swing at taking down infrastructure outside of a wartime scenario. Like, don't worry, we shouldn't expect to see the lights and water and whatever go out unless it's war. And the Pipe Dream capability was explicitly designed to be disruptive and destructive, and by all our available intelligence was getting ready to be deployed against US energy infrastructure. And to me, that was, it wasn't a shock, but it was kind of a shock against the mindset that somebody really wouldn't take a swing at us. It looked like somebody was going to be taking a swing at us outside of a shooting war. My question to you is, with that context and the discussions that you have, do you get the sense that there's a changing mindset in the executive leadership, not just in the administration, but across the Senate and so forth, on understanding that we don't have the luxury of not having to worry about attacks outside of a wartime scenario?
I do. I think that in several ways. One, I think there's an increasing realization you don't need to be the target to be the victim, right? You know, if WannaCry and NotPetya should have taught us that in 2017, but increasingly, right, you just need to be that vulnerability that somebody discovered through happenstance to be the victim of the day, right? And so, you know, we're all in this. We all understand that there's a shared risk here. Two, I think that increasingly we realize that discussions about a cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11 perhaps mischaracterize the nature of this domain. This is a domain which is sufficiently diffused in time and space that those things may in fact be happening. We're just not seeing them as a single cathartic event. They're happening all around us. It's the rot, you know, it's the corrosive kind of ability of these cyber attacks to kill us by death by 1,000 cuts. And frankly, the risk that we have seen to data and systems, the risk that we've seen as an abstraction of that to critical functions is now kind of creeping into, insinuating itself into risk to confidence that we might not be able to use these systems for the societal purposes that we were so boldly optimistic about 30 years ago or 5 years ago, right? And so I think there's a growing sense that that's an issue that we all need to solve. And I do see boards, I do see policymakers saying this is no longer something that the technologist alone should be responsible for. We need to take responsibility for this in the same way that any company worth its salt will think about the people that it brings to bear, will think about the strategy it brings to bear. Increasingly needs to think about the technology that we bring to bear, or actually how does it build all of those into some single system, some single threaded continuous system. So I do think that that is changing. My biggest worry is not, frankly, the Russians or any other actor in this space. We should be concerned about them, but that's not my biggest worry. My biggest worry is what I describe as proactive ambivalence, or for that matter, just complacency, right? Where folks would look at this and say, hey, there's a problem in this space. There's smoke galore pouring out of this house. But then they would sit back, fold their arms and say, I can't wait to see who fixes it, or it's somebody else's problem to fix. Each of us needs to participate in the defense of this. Just like I participate in the defense of myself in the physical world, I lock my car even when I come to the White House campus. I look both ways when I cross a busy cyber street. I don't leave my iPad on the dash of my car. I don't leave the key in the ignition, even though it would be a heck of a lot easier for me to get a quick start at the end of the day. I participate in my own defense in ways that are just natural and reflexive, intuitive. We need to make sure that we do the same thing in cyberspace, right? That every one of us has a role to play. I think that's what we've got to do going forward.
I'm going to follow up on that a little bit in regards to the every role to play. Looking across this group of people that we have here, and I wish you were here to meet some of these amazing people. But
I do too. I take my tie off for starters.
yeah, we'd cut it off when you came in. The group of folks here, you kind of look at them. I know what they're doing day to day, kind of in their very, very mission focused. They're not waiting for jobs. They're finding work. They're doing things. They have a long list of stuff to do. And kind of along that final comment you just made in regards to, this isn't the group of people that would be waiting outside of a house watching it burn, wondering who's going to save the day. They are the people that are in doing everything they can do to stop that fire. But from your perspective, we have a lot of tasks that we're working on a daily basis, whether we're talking about governance, whether we're talking about new compliance regs, we're talking about safety systems, we're talking about operations, cybersecurity, engineering new facilities, looking ahead years and years, what systems do we need to start thinking about now and building. But if you had to pick something that you would want to leave in this group that know in your heart and mind that if you say it, they're going to go back and action it, what thing would you say, consider this in your prioritized list of something to go action and pursue, whether it's capital or O&M or something big or small?
Well, I would do three things. Since you've kind of reserved the right to ask 5 questions as one, I'll give 3 answers as one. I would say first and foremost, we need more coherence in the system. Now that's a fancy term, but we need to figure out what is it that all the various parties and players in this space have an accountability, responsibility to do. Part of my job, part of the federal government's job is to use its convening power, right? And it's perhaps its position as the owner of a bully pulpit to kind of assert and hopefully then play a viable component in what should that new social contract be. What's the government's responsibility to support the private sector? What's the government's responsibility to establish a viable collaboration between the private and public sector? How does the government place itself in a role where it's the supporting organization for increasingly the supported organization, which is the private sector? How do we create practical, right, kind of implementation of what I've described, again, I'm in a big hand, little map way of resilience by design and a collaborative defense. Let's get on with saying, let's sort out those roles and responsibilities. That's job one. And each of you, given the thought leadership that you exercise, can speak to that. Kind of speak to your board, speak to your customers in the terms that they would understand about what is at risk for them, why they should care about this, and how they should then put some of their time and talent to it. That's thing two. How do we then describe not just what the folks with IT or cyber in their job titles do? This is not their responsibility alone, but what all of us do. We're about to kind of sponsor an education summit, a workforce summit at the White House in the next couple of months that is essentially going to address this problem of how do we make sure that everyone has the skills, awareness, education necessary to take full advantage of cyberspace? How do we make sure that many professions, legal professions, maybe it's folks who go through MBA programs, but that they know more about cyberspace, that they understand the implications of their choices. And then, of course, how do we fill those few jobs, only 500,000 jobs at the moment that are empty, that have the word cyber or IT in them. But I'm worried as much about the 350 million as I am worried about the 500,000. So we have to solve those skill-based issues. And then finally, we need to make sure that as much fun as operational response is, that we spend as much or more time on the capital expenditures, resilience by design, so that we prevent some of this. We get left of the event. And much of that work is done in the formative moments of designing the next operational technology, designing the next ICS system, so that it actually has kind of the components, the attributes that are required to build resilient, robust systems and to preserve that resilience and robustness across the life cycle. I'll just leave you with a quick anecdote. It's a sad one, which I was talking to a parent about a month ago that was kind of seeing their kind of son or daughter graduate from this amazing computer science program. I won't tell you the institution since I don't want to malign them. And I said, great, are they thinking about going to the cyber world? God, no, they won't have anything to do with cyber. They're going to do computer science. And I thought to myself, how are those two things strange bedfellows? Everybody's doing cyber. It doesn't matter whether that's in your job title or not, right? And so whatever institution they graduated from didn't actually tell them that from day one, you're actually implicated in the plot. So we just need to make sure that we all understand what our individual responsibilities are. That's a new social contract as much as it's a technology proposition.
Fantastic. We'll ask you two more questions, and I think we'll stop monopolizing your time. We have a global audience here at SANS. We've obviously got a lot of folks here in the room, but when you talk about the 4,000 around the world, many different countries represented, and many of us going through the exact same challenges. And so we look to, you see what's happening in Singapore with the OT master plan, you look at what's happening in Australia with ACSC, you look at what's happening in UK with the national security, the NCSC. Different countries around the world are starting to have the same kind of conversation. So my question to you is, what is the administration doing? What are you doing? What is the group doing in terms of engaging those foreign partners? And specifically, what are you actually seeing that is coming as a result of that?
That is a great question. So when I argue, as many of us do, that we should have resilience by design and a collective collaborative defense, that needs to be done in the largest possible context, the international context, right? This can't be done by one nation alone. It would never work. The internet does not stop at those national boundaries. It runs roughshod ruthlessly across those. Plus, we don't have a monopoly on good ideas in any one nation, let alone the United States. And so we should look over the shoulders of just about every other. Could you grab me that binder over there? I'm about to hold this thing up. No, not you. I'm sorry. Somebody's in the room with me here. So I've got this binder that I've been reading through, and it says partner nation cyber strategies. And inside of this are 10 strategies by other nations that represent not just the ones you mentioned, but others as well. There's a lot to be learned in that. There's a lot of common good in that, but there's a lot to be learned. I spent several days in Australia 3 weeks ago. I spent 2 days in Singapore a week and a half ago. I'm meeting today with 2 partner nations here in the White House to have that very discussion. What is it that are the common foundations of our collective cybersecurity? How do like-minded nations then push that forward so that companies that operate across those boundaries and citizens who reach across those boundaries have the common confidence that that system will support their needs? I think that's what we need to do, is to think about this in an international context and get this right. If we do that, we'll be using something that many of our adversaries don't: alliances. They don't have allies. They don't have partnerships that essentially go down to the bedrock of common principles, common values. We do. We should not throw that value, that opportunity away by ignoring it or being complacent about it. We should actually kind of grab it, leverage it, and move it forward as one of the principal kind of components of our strategy. Hey, I really appreciate the time that you all have given to this today. I certainly wish I could spend 2 days in Orlando with you. I promise I would not wear my tie. But I think I would learn quite a lot. And so I look forward to learning more over time from you, from venues like this. Thanks for the time given this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.